Okay, I guess we're on. Um, this little recording or audio recording begins with talking about my latest revisions to my text at Wikiversity, um, which the subsection I'm going to be focusing on I call no longer groping for the truth. But I'm going to repeat myself a few times because I guess I consider it to be significant enough. So I'll start off with an abstract that I put on my website. Free energy does not exist, and neither does electrical reactance. Both are fictions whose theorized existence has weathered our doubts for over a century of workable mathematics. This does not prove the existence of imaginary numbers, nor does it prove that they succeed at representing any variety of electrical reactance, free energy or otherwise. Instead, it demonstrates that we can get by without having to prove how to take the square root of a negative number. No one has a clue how to do that, and nobody expects to find out anytime soon. Without this proof, we have no proof for the existence of free energy, and we have no proof for the existence of electrical reactance, since the two are closely related. All we know is that our mathematical modeling succeeds with their simulations based on over a century of streetwise expertise. Alternately, if you wish to describe this in terms of my latest understanding, relativity is to the physicist what reactants, both electrical and magnetic, are to the electrical engineer, in that both deliver a perspective which is subject to circumstance for accurately assessing the measurements of energy. Ultimately, all of the criticisms that are leveled against free energy amounts to our ability to measure energy, which is fundamentally flawed in terms of how we look at it. We don't really look at it enough. In fact, Krishnamurti, considered to be an enlightened saint of India, he expressed the opinion that too often we humans do not take a thought to its natural conclusion. In other words, we stop midway and don't go all the way with it. And this is what I'm finding when we assess free energy. We make peremptory remarks based on not really thoroughly investigating the topic, because we've been told not to bother. And I might want to add, there is a parallel allegory or parallelism with regard to the attorneys, the legal profession. Attorneys will oftentimes start an argument in the middle of the argument. They will not start at the premise. They will assume a premise of their own choice and then proceed to ignore that while at the same time justifying it from midstream without having to justify it. In other words, it becomes a circular argument, a self-fulfilling proposition from their point of view, and they're trying to push that on their opponent, hoping they won't notice. Well, in electrical theory, we do that as well in physics. So I'm trying to relate here the correct way to look at free energy. And relativity is my latest endeavor or insight. So the expression that energy the energy entering a circuit must equal the energy coming out of it has no meaning by itself, because it's all based on our ability to measure the energy in the first place. If we don't even know how to measure the energy, how can we claim that there's more energy coming out than what went into it? This is really a problem, an oversight, a really glaring oversight. Likewise, a kilowatt has no relevance unless coupled with a per-hour reference, or else the electric utility company could never bill us for using their energy. Duration is one aspect of time, a generic aspect, which holds true for both magnetic and electrical reactances. Frequency is another aspect, an aspect which is, at the very least, specific to electrical reactance and not germane to reactance in general. Yet, electrical reactance alone also possesses the properties of capacitance, acting as a causative agent for its own unique form of reactance, namely capacitive reactance, while inductance spawns its own unique variety of reactance, namely inductive reactance, and both possess a phase relation between them which can maximize at a half cycle of oscillation, of separation, and thus qualify the over-unity circuit as a passive generator of electricity possessing no significant prime mover, acting instead as a mere stimulant for inducing over-unity. Excuse me. By the way, an equivalent term for over-unity is overreactance, allowed by the negative impedance of Foster's reactance theorem. So Foster's reactance theorem is an article on Wikipedia. You can look it up, and it explains itself very simply as being that of negative impedance. Now, negative impedance is the opposite of what's considered to be normal impedance. And impedance is the more complicated variety of resistance. So if I push against you, or if the wind pushes against you when you walk, that's simple resistance. But if you've got resistance in a coil of wire or equivalent series resistance in a capacitor, that's considered impedance, reactive impedance, and its reactive quality of impedance, as opposed to just simple resistance. But it's considered to be positive impedance. We always leave out that word positive because nobody wants to spend too much time dwelling on the fact that it has an opposite called negative impedance, which is the passive generation of power, requiring no significant prime mover. Now, a prime mover is usually considered to be something mechanical, but it can be something electrical. But when you look up the definition, they always give you mechanical variety. And the best illustration of a prime mover is if we took out the electric starter motor in our gasoline guzzling cars and went back to the century ago variety of hand cranking to start the engine, that would be a prime mover, the person giving the engine a hand crank. But when a coil of wire no longer has to be moved through a magnetic field in order to generate current, when all we need is a properly designed over-unity circuit that causes the current to reverse itself in that coil, now we don't have to apply a prime mover of any significant quantity of voltage, let's say coming from a battery pack. Instead, we can use whatever voltage is already available in the environment. Regardless of how little that might be, makes no difference. It'll be enough to cause current to go in reverse, and because that's considered to be reactive power, not real power, or a variety or an offshoot of reactive power, it will accumulate while it's being spent. It'll be spent insofar as the impedances, the positive impedances and the resistances will cause magnetism, magnetic fields and heat to be generated by the coil. But the portion that does not get stopped by resistance, the portion of current that does not get stopped by resistance or inductive impedance, will remain inside the coil as reactive power and continue to build up. Because when current goes in reverse in a passively generating coil, we are no longer diminishing the voltage differences between the two terminals of that coil. Normally, that's what current does. It goes in the same direction of polarity orientation as does the voltage that was applied to the coil in the first place, and the current is the reaction that we get out of that coil subsequent to the application of voltage difference applied to the two terminals of the coil. And the current's purpose in having the same polarity as the voltage is to equalize the voltage differences so that eventually the battery, let's say, that's supplying this voltage runs down, and we have to replace the battery or recharge it. But when current goes in reverse, not only is the coil passive rather than active, not only is it generating rather than consuming, it's still a load, but now it's also a generator, and it recharges the source. instead of killing the source, killing the dipole, as Tom Bearden would say, it's regenerating the source. It's recharging it. It's sending the current back to the source instead of depleting it by the same value. And that means you better take the source out of the way, or else you're going to have an exploded battery and have to put something else there as your source, namely the environment, you know, or what else? I mean, there are a lot of different techniques, but you got to start thinking about what you're going to do so that you don't blow up your source. You've got to diminish or eliminate your source and just use your environment as your source. And then you've got to deal with the FCC coming to your door because of all of the ham radio operators who are obliged to report any kind of radio interference in their neighborhood. And when the FCC gets enough reports together to triangulate and exactly locate where this interference is coming from, they're going to stop by your door and give you a knock, and with a warrant, take everything, including your sofa and your dining room set. They take everything. But at least you know you'll be performing an over-unity circuit in which you do not deplete your source anymore, so that you can turn to your environment as your exclusive source and not worry about carrying around a battery pack anymore, or having a long extension cord to your UFO. You know, I mean, those things really spend a lot of energy. They're very energy intensive or energy inefficient devices. Nonetheless, we have this hunger for gluttonous use of energy, and we want to make sure we have plenty of it and not have to pay through the nose. So relativity is the cover term that I consider to be the allowance factor for free energy. But in terms of open admission, in a roundabout fashion, Foster's reactance theorem does the job, because it specifies negative impedance, and from there you've got to figure out the rest on your own, such as the reversal of current, how do you go about doing that, blah, blah, blah. Well, I cover that in my wiki text, which I'm going to get to reading to you an excerpt in a few minutes. But right now I'm going through the abstracts. So this basic idea now that I've come to, conceding to physicists that their idea of relativity explains how reactance alone qualifies as the source of free energy. So to oversimplify the measurement of energy to mere duration alone as its frame of reference is an oversimplification of how thorough is the impact that a relativistic perspective has upon our measurements of energy. The broad topic of reactance is a fertile field for investigating the flexibility which this field of imaginary numbers has upon our measurements of real power enumerated by real numbers, since our measurements of real power are completely dependent upon an imaginary frame of reference existing within the domain of reactance. In other words, our physical measurements of energy are always at the mercy of requiring that these measurements be predicated upon the non-real imaginary world of the square root of -1. This imaginary world is a man-made fiction. It can never be proven. Yet over a century of engineering expertise is testimonial to the efficacy of imaginary numbers filling the gap in our physical assessment of energy, the quantification of energy. A thorough measurement, and an accurate one at that, must be predicated upon all of the factors of reactance, or else suffer from the consequence of our jumping to false conclusions about energy in versus energy out espoused by physics. Duration alone is not enough to measure energy in terms of. We have to include all of the other factors of reactance as well as its generic factor of duration. Kilowatt hours merely scratches the surface of credibility. So in other words, when I measure speed of a car in miles per hour, that hour is its duration of time that we consider how many miles we traveled in that duration. And duration, or an aspect of time, is a generic quality of reactance. Namely, we don't think about it, so we never qualify and call it reactance, let alone relativity. We just say it's we don't even say duration, we just say hours, time. We keep things so simple that we don't really comprehend what we are alluding to, the complexity and the breadth and depth of what we are alluding to. So when we say miles per hour, as an example, now let's switch to kilowatt hours. When we're billed by the electric company, so many kilowatts per hour, we have been spending their current that we drain from the wall outlet when they supply us a certain voltage at a certain frequency. And it's not enough to say per hour. It is okay in our simplified world of forcing energy in the form of forcing voltage on the customer, forcing voltage from the battery pack onto the motor controller of our EV, because it's forceful. It's on that force, that application of force of the full quantity plus a little extra of voltage and current is dependent on the presumption that we can't get enough energy from our environment. All that's there is a few microvolts, and the current is likewise very low. So we have this ridiculous idea that we've got to make up the difference ourselves, not realizing that relativity provides for the flexibility of how we can shift not only our theoretical perception of energy, our measurement of energy, but more importantly, the actual shift in perception that our circuitry can undergo when we have a properly designed over-unity circuit. It can change its perception of the energy that we give it, namely from our environment of a microvolt or a nanowatt or a picowatt, so convincingly that that circuit will believe, after a certain duration of time has elapsed, that, oh, you know what, that energy you gave me is not a nanowatt or a picowatt. It's actually 100,000 watts. And I now have enough power to run the electric motor and accelerate up a steep hillside or accelerate into freeway traffic from the street. That's literally what can happen over a sufficient duration of time, because there are other factors besides duration, besides time, that the circuit can play with, provided we don't force feed it. If we force feed it, it will never bother. In fact, it cannot overreact and make use of Foster's reactance theorem. Foster's reactance theorem, it's not stated in that article, that you only get access to negative impedance if you starve the circuit for power. You have to give it some to get it hungry. If you don't give it some, it won't be hungry. It'll be asleep. When you're sleeping, you're not hungry. But when you're hungry enough, you wake up. Or if you're awake, you realize you're hungry. Not when you're sleeping, unless you're dreaming about food. And so when you're awake, you can recognize you're hungry, and that's when you want to go and grab that food. Well, the circuit is not going to go and grab energy. It could grab it from the environment, and that's a problem of the environment getting in the way of the free energy process. But if the environment, such as a transmission line, does not get in the way, although it can work both ways, the circuit might steal energy from the grid, or it might supply energy to the grid if it's a true free energy circuit, because it will be shifting its perception of reality within itself such that the tiny amount of energy that it's getting from its environment or from from the environment, because let's say it's not directly coupled, magnetically coupled, it's wrapped around the transmission line, but simply, the transmission line is nearby and you're driving down the street, and the transmission line is overhead. So you're not directly coupling yourself or, your motor, the power station in your EV to the transmission line overhead, but you are nearby, but usually far enough away that you don't couple to it. So you're still, for the most part, getting your energy, your stimulus, not your energy, but your stimulus for amplifying energy from your environment. And then your circuit makes up the difference by expanding its perception of how much energy it's getting from its environment and it can or could broadcast it to the transmission line and serve to disturb it. And then you'd be a domestic terrorist, but you'd be supplying energy to your local power grid, because they're not accustomed to free energy circuits supplying reversal of current, supplying current back to the grid. Unless it's done in a licensed manner, namely solar panels on your rooftop. But nobody's licensed free energy circuits yet, so and I don't think you could, because they're very unpredictable. So standards would have to be set, and in order to license the manufacturing of free energy circuits. So we still have a ways to go. But in the experimental stage of the experimenter, and just me, just simulating it, just theorizing, just thinking about it, there's still a lot of wiggle room for the thing to settle down and for us to settle on the best assortment of free energy circuits to work with that are the most efficacious and user-friendly, blah, blah, blah. Now, my 6 years of experience with simulations of over-unity circuitry has led me to this conclusion, that energy does not appear out of nowhere in an over-unity circuit, nor does it disappear into nowhere. Instead, the circuit's point of view has become altered over a duration of time which can span any number of seconds, ranging from as little as nanoseconds to as much as 10 million seconds. And this is merely an example of the window of duration which may be affected by this alteration of the circuit's perception of how much energy did you and I give it versus how much energy does it spit out. For this window of duration is limitless in its potential scope for an adequate reactance to occur to alter the circuit's perception of its internal energy and give us sufficient energy to run an electric car at 100 kilowatts despite the nanowatt input from a meager solar panel or a whip antenna. I've seen simulations in which I cannot make a determination as to how quickly does the circuit explode with over-unity, no matter how small I make the simulation's time step. Likewise, I may be at a loss, and all of us as well, at having the patience to wait long enough to see whether or not a prospective over-unity circuit is capable of generating over-unity if its duration of operation were long enough. But it's not necessary to wait so long unless our development of an over-unity circuit is in its initial stages of development. With increased efficiency, an over-unity circuit can have its required wait time shortened to mere nanoseconds if its designer is willing to do whatever it takes to shorten that wait time. This is accomplished by recognizing that there are other factors, besides duration, that can be modified to affect a shorter duration of the circuit's recognizable over-unity. These additional factors are all of the factors of both electrical and magnetic reactance. Now, I've never studied magnetic reactance. I've just stumbled on it recently, so I can't speak of it, but it has numerous factors. I have studied electrical reactance, and I have determined that there are about 3 or 4 factors of electrical reactance, besides the generic factor of duration that pertains to reactance in general. There's about 3 or 4 factors of electrical reactance that can be manipulated to shorten this durations of time so that an over-unity circuit that's potentially possible, but you have to wait like 10 million seconds for the over-unity to appear to any appreciable degree. You can shorten that down to a fraction of a second if you make use of these other factors. And that's why I say that miles per hour is not enough to assess how much energy is that speed, that we're going at that speed. Because if we look into these other factors of reactance, then we truly will justify the use of relativity, that all things are relative to our point of view. And there are other factors to alter our point of view other than just duration or miles per hour alone. Because we can use capacitance and the capacitive reactance that comes out of that. We can use inductance. We can use frequency. And most importantly, phase relation between current and voltage, between inductivity and capacivity. um, if it's 180 degrees, if it's a whole half cycle of separation between the current and the voltage, um, then we can play with that and manipulate it to any degree that we want to, because now we've gotten the current to go in reverse. But we've also separated the current from the voltage so that it's the closest to becoming non-electricity. You know, electricity is only truly electricity when the current and the voltage are totally in phase, with 0 degrees of separation between them in time. When I say degrees of separation, I'm talking about temporal degrees of separation, in which we measure the cycle, we divide it up in 360 degrees per cycle. And so when we look at the peak of the current versus the peak of the voltage, are they in sync with 0 degrees of difference between them, so that they are, you know, like two musicians in a symphony orchestra who are keeping the beat and are both on the beat? Or are they syncopated, such that one beats and the other is pausing, and then the other beats and then the other pauses, totally in synchronicity of a half cycle out of phase with each other? That's where where it becomes possible to manipulate the energy inside a free energy circuit, or to manipulate our perception of that energy, is maybe the best way to put it, such that it looks like the energy is being magnified, when in reality we're not doing that at all. Now, our current understanding says, oh yeah, it's called parametric amplification, but in reality, the energy is not getting amplified because conservation of energy has to be upheld. It's our perception of energy that's being altered, not the energy itself. All right? It's a new idea to wrap our minds around. But if there's energy nearby, it may get stolen or contributed to, because reactive circuits are, if you try to translate reactance into Russian, they don't have a word for it. Their word is activity, or active. In other words, reactance is simply more active, that's all. It's so active that its quantity can change due to our perception of that activity. So energy is a verb, it's not a noun. It's not a cord of wood that you can carry, burn in your fireplace, use it up, and then go carry another cord of wood that weighs a certain amount, and you sweat a little carrying it in from outside, and you chopped it, and you went to all that labor. But energy, electrical energy, is not that at all. It's a verb, it's not a noun. And being a verb, it's totally amenable to perception, because it's not a noun. So we can shrink it and expand it simply by not working on it, but working on our perception of it, in which we change our perception of energy, and now it no longer looks like a kilowatt anymore. Now it looks like a microwatt, or it may look like 1,000,000,000 watts over a duration of time, and not right away, but sometimes that change does occur right away. But I prefer the types of change that are gradual, because then I can have a better chance at regulating the rate at which that change occurs. Because ideally, I have surmised or taken a guess estimate that the ideal time frame is 1/10 of a second, in which if I want to get that 100,000 watts of power from the micro or the nanowatt or the picowatt from the environment, I want to get it in 1/10 of a second, because I'll want the motor in my electric car to respond that quickly. When I want to accelerate and pass somebody on the freeway, I'm going to want the response in 1/10 of a second. So 100 milliseconds is usually my target for producing that 100,000 watts of power from the nano or picowatts available to the car from our environment. Now, this is a section from my wiki text at wikiversity.org, and the title is Draft: Free Energy Does Not Exist. And as you can see, they don't like what I have to say, and so they put these tags there. And in fact, they still don't like it, because it comes up on Google very high on the list. And so they've forced the uh, they've forcefully sequestered my article into the draft stage so that it doesn't come up on Google. So you can't search for it unless you go to Wikiversity and then search for it, or maybe not even then. Let's see if you can search for it. If we take this title, and if we search for it in the search box at Wikiversity, yeah, it does come up. Look at that. So, but you can only do it. No. Oh, see, it doesn't come up. All these other things come up. How do you like that? Metaphysics. Happiness. Does God exist? So no, I think you have to put in the word draft. No, see? They don't want you to find it. Green energy, green renewables. So, let's face it, they don't want you to find me. They really, and so what they wanted me to do in order to not be forced into this draft condition is they wanted me to admit in my opening paragraph that this is pseudoscience, what I'm promoting, what I'm talking about. And of course, why would I want to do that? It's not, why should I do their job for them? You know? If I'm the author, I write it according to my point of view. See? So already I was annoyed that they were forcing their point of view onto me. And here now I've come to the conclusion that everything is about point of view, and that's why relativity explains free energy. So I don't need to concede that this is pseudoscience. This is on the vanguard of science, yeah, fringe if you like, but not pseudo. This is not pseudoscience. Fringe science, yeah, only because it's the vanguard of science, because we don't take it, the idea of relativity far enough. Okay? So I have these opening paragraphs, and then I get to the contents, and it's a very long table of contents. So I start off talking about energy versus power, and that's the only way to deal with it. So why don't we do that? Let's go to that. Free energy is the presumption that energy is infinitely available. In other words, some of the outputs or internal states grow without bounds. Due to a potentially limitless supply of reactants, both magnetic and electric, versus power, which is at the very least the method of regulating the rate at which energy is used per unit of time. Consequently, free energy has more to do with the non-accountability of power than it has to do with energy, since reactant energy is assumed to be unstable when its frame of reference is altered from its default condition established by nature through the interventions of the eminent domain of the electric utility grid or by perpetual motion machines. This charade makes the reactant byproduct of energy appear to be limitless for all intents and purposes, so long as there is always sufficient wiggle room for the alteration of perspective which reactance affords us. This is what makes energy free. It is the boundless relativity of reactance. The reversal of current, which is brought about by various reactances of one kind or another, is the method by which energy may be shuffled around the universe against voltage gradients and effectively uphill. This overrides the diffusion of energy which would have resulted in entropy and the elimination of voltage differences between any 2 points in space. Without these voltage differences, we are powerless to make use of energy, no matter how much energy may reside within our universe. Thus, the negation of current allows us to supersede the side effects of the natural order of cosmic law as our universe winds down from exhaustion as described by physics, and safeguard our material existence despite this natural tendency of an entropic universe, and because of this safeguard of negative impedance, namely the reversal of current. So this is not what free energy is. It's the opposite of this. A damped oscillation is not what free energy is. because 0 in the denominator of any fraction is at worst not a number. At best, 0 in the denominator might render as infinity within real or complex projective geometry if the numerator is not also 0. But this latter possibility is not the case. So the normal, this is a little too much. There we go. So the normal, where are we? Well, this is supposed to say indeterminate, so that's still not enough. Okay, go down a little bit more. There we go. There, indeterminate. So it would give us undefined indeterminate, and we won't be able to calculate the Q factor, the quality factor, which is 2 pi times the energy stored divided by the energy dissipated per cycle, because the energy dissipated is 0. So it's undefined. Now what free energy is this baby. It's this oscillations that grow in magnitude towards infinity. And it's the opposite of damping, as a question was asked at Math Stack Exchange. And it is considered unstable according to electrical engineering. It's also called negative damping, and this is the equation for negative damping that you can put in. You can enter it in at Wolfram. That's what is.gd/neg damping goes to. It goes to, well, let's put it in here. It goes to Wolfram Alpha. Ah, yes, my favorite character. Oh, a little aside here. Yes, who's that fellow? Peter Pan. Peter Pan, he looks kind of Viking, doesn't he? It's probably the age range of Viking warriors. They were young, because they sure didn't live long. But that's my iconoclastic hero, is the Viking warrior, or Peter Pan, if you prefer. Let's get back to what we were doing here. See, what was I going to look up? Oh yeah, negative damping. Okay, so is.gd neg damping. So we go to Wolfram, it loads, here's the equation. I'm not allowed to put this on my wiki page, so I had to get the graph from somewhere else. But here it produces this nice graph that expands in amplitude over time. And that's what is.gd/neg damping will do. It'll take you to that website. But I got this off another website. It's a nice curvature thing. And the exponential growth of this cosine function is an example of negative damping, producing instability in which its output grows without bounds. So if you go to this article at Wikipedia called Instability, I literally quoted them. They say output grows without bounds, and this is what free energy is considered. And that's, if you want to get paid at the end of the month as an electrical engineer, you cannot afford to have an unstable circuit. You cannot afford to have a free energy circuit. So literally, I had an argument with an electrical engineer at Quora, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing him write, what I was reading, what he wrote. He kept saying over and over, he really stood by his guns. He kept promoting the idea that if an idea does not sell, if it does not make money, it cannot be true. Truth is predicated on profit. Now at Wikipedia, they have a different variety of truth. Their variety of truth is democracy. We all vote on it, and the majority decides what's true, based on what does the scientific literature say. Now, you're not going to get this kind of thing printed in the scientific literature. I'll try, but I doubt it'll be pass their guard. I'll give it a try. Why not? Now that I'm done with Wikipedia, or excuse me, Wikiversity, because I've already submitted a paper and had it accepted to a scientific journal. But, you know, the funny thing is, it's on a list along with other scientific journals that are not considered reputable because they print anything. And it's true. I noticed that. I kind of wondered about that. They take your money, $80 or whatever it is, and they just print whatever you have to say. So it can't be considered peer review. But you won't find this kind of thinking in a peer review. In fact, I don't even get to put my text at Wikibooks, let alone or even a non-draft version at Wikiversity, let alone Wikibooks. I've tried already, and I got shunted into this sequestered status. So, see, normally, sorry, you don't get to print, you don't get to just submit a text to Wikiversity. You have to submit it for peer review. If you already had it printed or published in a peer review journal, then you can put it in Wikiversity. But because I had already put it in Wikibooks, they were able to kind of concede to allow it to be in Wikiversity, but then they didn't, and now they put it into draft status, so they really don't want it because it has not been peer reviewed. Anyway, this is the kind of resistance I get to my new ideas. Well, I was still groping at the time. It kind of makes sense. So let's see. So where does it come from? Well, simulators don't give us the answer. You could say it's stealing it from the grid, but that's not really the case. So, I no longer need to grope for the truth. I used to feel the need to judge and blame physicists for the lies and theft which they have protracted against electrical engineers and inventors in the name of science, and my disdain for politics, namely the patent office in every country, inaugurating these atrocities in the name of goodwill and common sense. But that was due to my having to grope my way through the numerous lies to get to the single most important truth. So if you click on this link, lies and theft, I just took everything that was at the top of my Wikiversity text, and moved it to the bottom, calling it, let's see, what did I call it? Old worn-out criticisms. So all these old worn-out ideas that I don't need to go through anymore, they're at the bottom for historical purposes, If I can find out where I am here. Oh, I see. Well, let's go back and get the link. Here it is. So I no longer need to do that. Now I just focus on the positive, focus on this new insight. There are many truths to this saga, but some truths are more relevant than other truths. Blame and the judgment of sinners is not one of them. The most significant truth is to congratulate physicists for having contributed to our pursuit of knowledge, regardless of how they have gone about it. They have given us relativity, which helps to explain why energy can appear or disappear so convincingly that we choose to ignore these anomalies, claiming instead that there is some fault somewhere else giving us what we presume to be false information. In truth, relativity explains the non-creation and the non-destruction of energy when we are faced with its unaccountable, i.e., non-thermodynamic appearance and disappearance, by providing us with a shift in our perception of energy. This shift is so convincing that even our circuits are convinced. This shift occurs due to all of our measurements of energy are founded upon power, and what impact power always has upon our measurement and perception of energy. This foundation is due to the presence of reactive power, since real power plays no role in the modification of our measurement of energy. Real power conserves our perception of energy against its modification, while reactive power does not and cannot prevent this alteration of perception to occur. Since reactive power is a fiction born of another man-made fiction known as the square root of -1, no one has the guts to admit that half of electrical engineering is predicated upon a belief in a fiction. Meanwhile, physicists conveniently ignore this salient fact. But relativity allows reactants to alter the magnitude of energy so convincingly and so benignly and so seamlessly that we tend to ignore this alteration when it happens, or else explain it away with some trite excuse. There is no other way to explain free energy. Reactants can sometimes act like a pump whenever the overreactive negative impedance of current reversal occurs due to Foster's reactance theorem. This current reversal is capable of pumping energy against gradients of positive impedance and simple resistance. And if a man-made device such as the electric utility grid should get in the way of this pumping action, then so be it. the energy of this man-made device will be running the risk of having its energy either stolen from itself, or else it will have energy added to itself due to the overreactance and the sustained reversal of current of the free energy device. Thank God for relativity. And all of my references of relativity link to an article on Wikipedia called The Twin Paradox. Now, it likes to say, this article likes to keep repeating over and over again, that the twin paradox is not really a paradox. It's a thought experiment in special relativity involving identical twins, one of whom makes a journey into space in a high-speed rocket and returns home to find that the twin who remained on Earth has aged more. This result appears puzzling because each twin sees the other twin as moving, and so as a consequence of an incorrect and naive application of time dilation and the principle of relativity, each should paradoxically find the other to have aged less. However, this scenario can be resolved within the standard framework of special relativity, in that the traveling twin's trajectory involves two different inertial frames, one for the outbound journey and one for the inbound journey. Another way of looking at it is to realize that the traveling twin is undergoing acceleration, which makes him a non-inertial observer. In both views, there is no symmetry between the space-time paths of the twins. Therefore, the twin paradox is not actually a paradox in the sense of a logical contradiction. So, but I use it because it's a perfect example of how time, or the clock problem, as it is sometimes called, affects our measurement of speed. You know, the amount of energy, the amount of energy we extract from our battery pack when we want to accelerate from our cruising speed to pass a vehicle that's in front of us. It's going to take extra energy from the battery pack to do that. And so that extra energy, the net consequence of that extra energy expenditure is the additional 10 miles per hour that we measure on our speedometer, in addition to the 50 miles per hour or 60 miles per hour that we were already doing, which was our inertial frame of reference, because we're already cruising. So we don't feel the cruising once we get to that speed, but we want to accelerate to pass someone. That's when we feel our body pushed back against the seat of our car that we're sitting in, and that's also equivalent to the energy expenditure it took to accelerate. But we measure that acceleration in miles per hour. An hour is a fiction. It's a man-made fiction. It does not exist. The miles is not a fiction. We can pace it out. If we have a very long stride, maybe our stride is a yard long, we can pace out so many yards or so many meters per mile. We can do that. It's physical. We can actually walk that mile and measure it out with our paces. But the hour, we cannot. The hour has a clock, and it's not us. It's the clock. And in an oscillating circuit, each cycle of oscillation is its own cycle of time, its own reference for time. So we don't know what time is. We got to have something outside ourselves tell us what time is, and in a sense that's what we do when we pace out the mile, but it's not really physical. It's just a mental construct to help us deal with the passage of change. We call it the passage of time. And we assume that there's this clock in the universe, but it does not exist. That's why we say it's a relativistic situation, that it's all based on your speed. Except speed, we measure in terms of time, and that's where our adequacy fails us. To thoroughly understand energy, we have to measure our speed in something other than just mere time alone. It's okay, for starters, but it's an oversimplification. We have to include all of the factors of reactance, both electrical and magnetic, and I've only investigated electrical. I haven't even touched or scratched the surface of magnetic. But in the field of electrical, there are 3 or 4 factors: capacitance, inductance, phase relation, and frequency. And if we don't investigate that, if we don't qualify our measurement of energy in terms of those particular factors of reactance, including time, making 5 to start with, before we even get into magnetic reactance, 4 of electrical and 1 of generic reactance, we don't really know what we are measuring. And it's no small wonder that energy seems to appear out of nowhere and disappear into nowhere, because we have not done a thorough assessment of our measurement of that energy. We think we've measured it, but we really have not measured it. And if we measure it thoroughly, within the context fully of our full appreciation of how reactance qualifies the relativity of our measurement of energy, only then will we appreciate what free energy is and stop closing the door to inventors at the patent office claiming that, oh, that's a perpetual motion machine, which in itself is a lie, because perpetual motion machine implies isolation. And isolation is a lie. There is no such thing as an isolated circuit in the universe. Such a thing does not exist. Circuits are not isolated. Let's see, where is it? Here we go. Perpetual motion machines. It's a lie. It doesn't exist. It's made up a lie. It's made up lie in order to explain away over unity devices. Is the motion of a perpetual motion machine is a hypothetical machine that can do work infinitely without an external energy source. Well, no, I do have to give it some energy, just not all of the energy that it needs. But I do have to give it some, because it has to hunger, and it can't hunger if I don't stimulate it with at least a little bit of energy. So it's not perpetual motion at all. Well, it's not a perpetual motion machine by the standard definition of perpetual motion machines. It is perpetual motion if we can keep shifting, continually shifting the circuit's perception of energy such that the energy that it's spending has not depleted itself. It continually gets refilled from the available energy that it has not completely spent yet. We keep expanding that due to the instability of our circuit. It has to become more and more unstable. Isolated system. So perpetual motion machines are predicated on this idea that the system has to be isolated in order to be considered perpetual motion. And there's no such thing. It doesn't exist. They even say so. And I quote them at length. Classical thermodynamics is usually presented as postulating the existence of isolated systems. It is also usually presented as the fruit of experience. Obviously, no experience has been reported of an ideally isolated system. It is, however, the fruit of experience that some physical systems, including isolated ones, do seem to reach their own states of internal thermodynamic equilibrium. Classical thermodynamics postulates the existence of systems in their own states of internal thermodynamic equilibrium. This postulate is a very useful idealization, except it doesn't really exist. Here we go. Because of the requirement of enclosure and the near ubiquity of gravity, strictly and ideally isolated systems do not actually occur in experiments or in nature. Though very useful, they are strictly hypothetical. So it's a useful hypothesis, but it doesn't really exist. And it's useful to explain away free energy circuits by calling them perpetual motion machines, which in their definition requires that they be isolated from their environment. And of course, such a thing does not exist. So it's really significant that we don't misunderstand what's going on. It's very crucial that we understand what's going on so that we don't get the wrong idea about what's going on. Okay, so but that's the general idea of what I'm trying to present to you, that relativity means everything now to me in terms of explaining why does Foster's reactance theorem work in creating negative impedance in a starved circuit. Why does energy out, why can we allow for the energy exiting a circuit, a system of energy, is greater than the energy entering it? It's all because of relativity, because we don't take relativity to its full extent. Einstein was just scratching the surface with his thought experiment of the twin paradox. That's just scratching the surface. It's more involved than that. Okay, so I hope you appreciate that situation, and so we can move on to better things and stop arguing, because there's no need to argue.